So both Amy Goodman and Daniel Ellsberg thus do the complex work of showing us how wars are waged and how peace can be won. And we're indeed extremely privileged to have them both here with us this evening. So my plan is to pose a couple of questions to each of them, just to get us started, and then we'll take questions from the audience and hopefully have a wonderful, engaging conversation. So I want to start with you, Daniel. As somebody already mentioned, I think the Doomsday Machine is a must-read. And so in the first half of the book, Doomsday does the necessary and important work of narrating how this machine actually came to be built. Right? And you do this, I think, really interestingly by moving between your own personal story and the story of the institutions that produced the bomb. So could you talk to us first about why you think the Doomsday Machine is an apt name, an apt moniker for nuclear technology, and second, how you became, despite your own misgivings, when you were young, despite your own misgivings about bombs, a nuclear war planner?
Thank you, Madhavi. Let me ask here how many people in this audience were alive in a world where there were no nuclear weapons, like me. Can I see? Let's look around. Okay. How many were not, obviously? How many were not? You've lived all your lives in a world of nuclear weapons. But I'm not going to assume, if I may, in answering your question, that you remember, even those second people here, very much of about these weapons that have, in a way, defined your life. How many people here actually would say, honestly, modestly, that you know the basic difference between an A bomb and an H bomb? Okay, well, a fair number. This is a select audience. I would say often there's 3 or 4 hands in an audience this size. How many do not? See if you're here. Okay, right. Honest. Let me mention that as background, not for your benefit, but as a setting here. The A-bomb, the kind of bomb that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, came at a fission bomb. It splits heavy elements like uranium-235 and isotopes of heavy elements and plutonium and releases energy, was 1,000 times more powerful than the largest blockbusters of World War II. And the people who first raise your hands will remember those blockbusters. And they were 10 or 20 tons of TNT equivalent, which destroyed an entire city block with one bomb. The Nagasaki bomb was an A-bomb. It was 1,000 times more powerful in explosive yield. 20,000 tons, 18 to 20,000 tons equivalent of TNT. Now, Herb York, who was the first director of Livermore Lab, which was started really to promote H-bombs, Edward Teller's baby, he was known as the father of the H-bomb, once asked at Livermore Lab, how many weapons, nuclear weapons, does it take to deter nuclear attack? Which has always been by most Americans, even here, the thought of our primary, even our only real function of nuclear weapons, to deter a nuclear attack essentially by the Soviet Union. And his answer was 1, or perhaps 10. He said, at the utmost, 100, but it's closer to 1 than 100. Okay. In 1950, in 52, let's say, when Truman left office, when I graduated from college, Truman had built 1,000 Nagasaki-type bombs, operational, actually, which were mostly targeted on Soviet cities at that point. And the reason, in part answer to your question, how it came to be that we had this immense number of bombs targeted on cities, it couldn't really be understood, I think, unless you know what we've been doing in World War II. And just to summarize that, in March 9th and 10th of 1945, we dropped 300 bombers under Curtis LeMay, dropped incendiaries, burning Tokyo and creating a firestorm in Tokyo that killed 100,000 people in one night. The largest act of terror, killing civilians, unarmed non-combatants, at one time, in one night, ever in human history, more than either of the atom bombs that came later. And for every night thereafter, for the next 5 months before the atom bombs, we continued to try to kill as many Japanese civilians as LeMay could, perhaps 900,000 before the atom bombs, added some 300,000 in a matter of months with radioactivity. We'd earlier been doing that to German cities as much as we could, but they didn't burn as well as the Japanese bamboo and wood cities. And they only got 2 firestorms like Tokyo, Dresden and Hamburg, 3 altogether during that war. An atom bomb, as at Hiroshima, creates a firestorm every time, nearly every time. Actually, Nagasaki didn't for geographic reasons, but the firestorm is a peculiar type of fire, and you'll see why I'm emphasizing this in a moment, which spreads fire over a widespread area very fast by a deliberate tactic. As they say, it was hard to get. They only did it 3 times in World War II, though they tried almost every raid. And with this fire over a large area, a lot of bombers, or one nuclear weapon, creates updrafts of hot air which bring in winds at hurricane force from all sides around, or if there's a ground wind moving along, which increases the heat to an enormous degree. It's like a bellows working on a furnace, and consumes everything within that. It gets up to 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. As I say, that enabled them to kill 100,000 people in one night. The Hiroshima bomb was about 80,000, Nagasaki 58,000. So having made that as our policy of strategic bombing, when Curtis LeMay became head of Strategic Air Command, it was very natural of him just to use the atom bomb with the same kind of targeting, killing civilians, burning cities, destroying cities. As LeMay said to a colleague of mine, Sam Cohen, Sam, who was the father of the neutron bomb, it so happens at Rand, said, Sam, war is killing people. When you kill enough of them, the other side quits. And with that philosophy then, as I say, we had under LeMay, before the Soviets had any nuclear weapons, we had 800 or 900 going on 1,000 very shortly. Now, by the time Eisenhower left office after 8 years, we had 23,000 nuclear weapons, of which most of them, or more than half, were H-bombs. And very briefly, that came in 9 years after Nagasaki, in 1954, the first droppable bomb. And the first droppable bomb in 54 was 1,000 times the Nagasaki bomb in yield. 15, or the Hiroshima bomb, actually, 15 kilotons. And this was 15 megatons, 15 million tons equivalent of TNT in one bomb. That would be, I believe, by the way, more than the explosive power in all the wars of centuries, probably, well, of history. You didn't have bombs earlier that much. More in one bomb than had been exploded in World War II, World War I, Civil War, et cetera. And I say we came to have thousands of them, targeted on, again, every city in Russia, USSR, and China, automatically. And let me mention then one thing that's at the beginning of this book, why it's called the Doomsday Machine, though not the full answer. I drafted a question for President Kennedy in 1961 for when you were a little baby, I guess, right? and when I had been consulting on command and control and on nuclear war plans for some time, and I drafted the question which got sent to the Joint Chiefs of Staff by the President, in the President's name, which was, if your plans are carried out as planned, and as I've been suggesting here, they were essentially first strike plans. They started out at a time when Russia had no weapons. And later, our NATO strategy has always been based on the threat of initiating nuclear war. So they were essentially first strike plans. And the question was, how many people will be killed in the USSR and China? And let me go a week ahead. They had an answer to that. And let me actually jump ahead here from my book and not give that first answer, but the answer a week later when I asked, How many altogether? The first answer actually was 325 million in the USSR and China alone. A week later, when we asked all of them, they said another 100 million in East Europe, the captive nations, we call them, the satellites, 100 million in West Europe, our NATO allies, by the radioactive fallout from our attacks. So that gets up to 525 million, and another 100 million in neutral countries or countries contiguous to the USSR, Austria, Finland, but also India, Afghanistan. 100 million there, a total of 600 million, or 100 Holocausts, as it seemed to me when I looked at that paper. I thought, this is the most evil plan that has ever existed. It should not exist as an estimate or a basic plan. It raised questions not only about my country, but about our species, because I didn't assume that we were the only people capable of such plans. Actually, we were the only ones in terms of numbers of warheads at that point, but within a few years, the Soviets were imitating us and also had. Now, this wasn't a doomsday machine because it was about a fifth of the Earth's population of 3 billion at that time, except that it didn't account for fire, too hard to calculate. So it was just blast and radioactive fallout and thermal. If you added fire, which is the main effect, you get up to 1 billion, about a third of the Earth's population then. Or as Teller, I've heard him say this myself, the father of Abraham, say, at most, with H-bombs you can kill, he said a quarter, he should have said a third of the Earth's population, the glass 2/3 full from his point of view. But he was wrong. Actually, Herman Kahn, my colleague at RAND at that time, invented the term doomsday machine, which came up a few years later as a major feature in Dr. Strangelove, quoting Herman, actually, quoting his own words. In fact, Herman had asked for some royalties out of that, which he didn't get. And as Kubrick says, it doesn't work that way. And he said this was a device that would kill almost all, or actually he said all, human life on Earth. And why would you want to have such a thing? Well, because it could be much cheaper than our current deterrent. The Strategic Air Command has to plane warheads or send by missiles thousands of miles over to hit targets. This doomsday machine could, in principle, be in your own country or in the oceans. So it would be a lot cheaper. I wouldn't even need even regular warheads that could survive coming down through the atmosphere. It could just be devices that you blow up in your own country, with the collateral damage effect of killing everyone. So he said, no one has built such a system or would ever build it. Kills too many people, everybody, in fact. So they wouldn't do it. He was wrong, and Teller was wrong. We had a doomsday machine at that time. Russia did too, actually, without even being able to target the US, but just by their attacks on Europe would have, I'll come to that in just a moment. But it did exist, and it had existed, as I've said, really since 1950. So in this case, we didn't know it. And the reason was that these bombs targeted on cities, even if that was only a minority of their targets, it was always a minority. The majority was has been always to this day, on military targets, most of which are in cities or next to cities. So the cities burn in firestorms, and because of the blast and the firestorm, the smoke from the cities, which was never calculated until 1983, 40 years almost into the nuclear era, the smoke would be lofted into the stratosphere where it wouldn't rain out and would go around the world very quickly, blotting most sunlight, 70% of sunlight, for what is now known to be more than a decade. The first estimates were about a year. But a year does the job because it not only creates ice age conditions on the surface of the Earth, cold and dark and dry, but it kills all the harvests. And there's about a 60 days global supply of food in the Earth at any given time, more most of it in countries like us who are exporters, if we can. That would be quickly done under this. So nearly everyone would starve. Not quite extinction, because perhaps 1% of the population would live on fish and mollusks in the southern hemisphere, in Australia or New Zealand, but 99% would go. That was true then, and it's true now for the US and Russia. It's been true for Russia as well since the mid-60s. So the answer is, we have two clear-cut doomsday machines on hair trigger alert. Hair trigger because each side has intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, vulnerable on land, each vulnerable to the other side. The sub-launched missiles are not vulnerable. They alone can cause nuclear winter or destroy all life, but the ICBMs will be destroyed if they don't get off before the other missiles get to you. So on warning, which has been false warning well, many times to some degree, but very seriously half a dozen times, there's a great pressure to launch those ICBMs on either side before they're destroyed, use them or lose them. And so they constitute hair triggers, basically, on two doomsday machines. The reason that India and Pakistan don't have doomsday machines now is they only have A bombs, not H bombs. I didn't describe the difference except in scale, but here's another way to think of it. Every H bomb, of which each of us, Russia and the US, had over 10,000 some years ago, each one needs a Nagasaki-type bomb for its trigger, for its detonating cap. You've seen a picture of Nagasaki after the bomb. It looks exactly, by the way, like Tokyo after the incendiaries 5 months earlier, which you almost never seen. But there it is. And this was accomplished with one bomb. No moral difference, but effectively one bomb. That's what happens to a city when you explode on it the percussion cap, the detonator, the match to a modern thermonuclear weapon, which is the heart of our weapons now. Well, India and Pakistan actually don't have those yet, nor does North Korea. They've claimed they have one, but they've tested one. But they're prepared, they claim, Kim Jong-un, to stop the testing of H-bombs. It probably takes a number of tests to get an operational one. India and Pakistan do not have operational H-bombs. So with their fission bombs, just 50 each, and they each have more than 100, they would cause smoke in the stratosphere that would cut out 7%, not 70%. It wouldn't cause nuclear winter. It would reduce harvests to the point that would starve the least nourished 2 billion people of the planet, a third of the Earth's population, a little more. And like as we could do with blast alone some years earlier, if testing restarts, they will quickly get H-bombs, and then they can have full doomsday machines. So that's the doomsday machine we're talking about, and I'll have to make the next part. I indulged myself because I took it. How many people knew pretty much everything I've just said? Okay, a fair number. How many did not? Okay, good. Well, I didn't. I warned her that I might want to take a little time to get us into this subject, and I have. On the question of how could I possibly have been part of this, the answer is that I grew up, 14 at the end of the war, with the belief, some years later, that there was a missile gap in favor of the Soviets. They were the first to test an ICBM, and shortly thereafter an intercontinental missile. We weren't able to do it for some while after that. And they put up Sputnik with that. How many people remember Sputnik? Remember BTP? Well, that showed that they could do an ICBM, and that was accurately, and that was sooner than we could. So the notion rose that they were ahead of us. That was in 57. In 58, I went to the Rand Corporation and was given top secret estimates that the Soviets, if they had a crash program, would have 300 ICBMs by 1960 or so, going on thousands in the early 60s. In 1961, again, when I'd been working on the plan, as I said, the commander of SAC, Strategic Air Command, estimated that the Soviets at that time, in August of 61, had 1,000 ICBMs. We had 40. So the missile gap. A month later, we learned from our satellite reconnaissance, what they actually had, which was 4. Not 1,000, not 250, not 40, but 10 times less than we did at that point. So when you ask how I got into this, the answer is it was to stave off nuclear war by a surprise attack by the Soviets, postpone it at least, make it more dangerous, less likely to occur. I thought of it as the best way to avoid or prevent or at least postpone a nuclear war. That's how I got into it. Just as scientists at Manhattan Project were working on a bomb, despite great misgivings, to head off a German crash program, which didn't exist. The Germans had stopped a major program in '42, about the time we started. And so they worked in this delusion, but a reasonable one at that time, that they were racing the Germans to it. Well, same way. I thought we were racing the Soviets in order to deter them. Actually, we had the only first strike capability in the world at that point, but we didn't have it long. You know, by the mid-'60s, they had enough ICBMs and sub-launch missiles that it was ridiculous to think that there would be anything but doomsday for each of us. We didn't know yet about the nuclear winter, which meant everybody goes, but the Northern Hemisphere, we did know would go by that time. That was the '60s, you know, that time ago. We have continued to build the capability for a first strike, despite its omnicidal nature. A philosopher named Somerville coined the word omnicide for killing everybody. So we had sort of a strategic omnicide machine at that point, command. At that point. We've had it ever since. And both parties have been committed to rebuilding that doomsday machine in the full knowledge, or at least availability of the knowledge, that what you're talking about is reconstructing and modernizing an ability to starve everyone on Earth, to destroy the food supply of everyone on Earth, kind of the starvation command, essentially. And that's what we've been up to. As I say, when I became aware that we were preparing to destroy a third, I was appalled. That obviously went beyond any necessity for deterrence of any kind that I could imagine. And I've been trying ever since to understand how Americans like me did build that machine and have kept it going to this day.
That's So, Amy, if you could come in here, actually drawing on Daniel's last sort of comment.
Ditto.
No, but talking about the media, you know, and particularly drawing, of course, on your experience with Democracy Now. You have, you know, very sort of emphatically stated that the media can actually be, right, the greatest force for peace on Earth. And instead, it is too often wielded as a weapon of war. So can you talk us through, you know, drawing on your experiences with Democracy Now, why you believe the media can be a force for peace? How do we, you know, Daniel has this really evocative portion in the introductory chapters in the book, where when he's talking about how he got involved, right, with nuclear war planning, you know, the ways in which Nazism was central, right, and talked about within the Manhattan Project, becomes the ways in which Stalinism gets talked about, right, in the 1960s. Missing then, I mean, the comparison is so easy. This discursive environment that is built is so totalizing that some of that complexity, right, is lost. It's in that context I was wondering if you could talk about, right, how the media could actually function as a force for peace. Yeah.
Well, first of all, it's a great honor to be here and to be with all of you, to be with Madhavi and Dan, with all the Right Livelihood Laureates, with my colleagues, Dennis Moynihan and Mike Burke, who are here so we can produce the show in the basement of the McHenry Library at 5 in the morning tomorrow and today.
Without me.
And coming back together with Juan Carlos Davila, who is a PhD student here, but was our Democracy Now! Fellow last year in New York, and we traveled together to Puerto Rico to cover the aftermath of Hurricane Maria. To be with all of you is so important. And to be here in the land of KPFA, the first Pacifica station. And if you haven't already contributed to KPFA, you know they have been pleading and begging recently, so please call up, make your pledge, and then pay it. But why? Because, well, it goes to your question about the importance of media. KPFA is the first Pacifica station, born after World War II, founded in 1949, founded by a war resistor named Lou Hill when he came out of the detention camps here. He said there's got to be a media outlet that's not run by corporations that profit from war, but run by journalists and artists, and that's how Pacifica was born. The first station, KPFA here, 49, 59, KPFK in Los Angeles, 60, my station in New York, WBAI, 1977, WPFW in Washington, and 1970, KPFT in Houston. Those are the 5 stations. And KPFT went on the air in 1970, and it's the only radio station in the country that was blown up. Just a few weeks into its operation, the Ku Klux Klan strapped dynamite to the base of the transmitter and blew it to smithereens, right in the middle of Arlo Guthrie singing Alice's Restaurant, which I thought was a good song. So anyway, they get back on their feet a few weeks later, they rebuild the transmitter, and the Klan straps 15 times the dynamite to the base of the transmitter and blows it up again. It'll take months now for KPFT to rebuild itself. And then the national media came in. It was January of 1971 to cover this phoenix rising from the ashes. Arlo Guthrie came to Houston to finish his song on the air. And it went back on the air. And I can't remember if it was the Exalted Cyclops or the Grand Dragon, because I often confuse their titles, but he said it was his proudest act. And I think that's because he understood how dangerous independent media is. Dangerous because it allows people to speak for themselves. And when you hear someone speaking from their own experience, whether we're talking about Dr. Tarek Loubani today on Democracy Now!, a Canadian physician who went to help the injured Palestinians in their nonviolent resistance in this last 6 weeks, and on Monday, he was shot in both legs by the Israeli military. But actually, he was lucky. Yes, he was one of 19 Palestinian or any nationality paramedics or doctors who were shot on Monday by the Israeli military. The paramedic who came to help him, who helped to make sure he didn't bleed to death, was shot to death an hour later by the Israeli forces. So whether you hear Dr. Tarek Loubani on Democracy Now!, or an Israeli grandmother, whether you hear an Afghan uncle or an Iraqi aunt or an elder from the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation in North Dakota, I'm not saying you will agree with what you hear. How often do we even agree with our family members? But you begin to understand where someone is coming from. It's that understanding that's the beginning of peace. I think the media can be the greatest force for peace on earth. Instead, all too often, it's wielded as a weapon of war, which is why we have to take the media back. Um, you know, today, in the age of Trump, when the president calls the media the enemy of the American people, the media has begun to find its backbone, right? They begin to sound a little like Democracy Now! When they say, you know, we are essential to the functioning of a democratic society. You know, the media must be holding those in power accountable. And it's really laudable that they say that and they stand up. And they have done that in some admirable cases. But there are two issues where even under Trump and the onslaught, his attack on the media, they find it extremely difficult to separate themselves from those in power. And the two issues are war and climate change. On the issue of war, Trump comes to power, and within a few weeks, he's bombing Syria. I wanted to quote him directly. I'm not talking about Fox. I wanted to quote Brian Williams of MSNBC. I remember coming home that night, turning on the TV. The US had just bombed Syria. And Brian Williams said, "We see these beautiful pictures at night from the decks of these two US Navy vessels in the Eastern Mediterranean. I am tempted to quote the great Leonard Cohen, 'I'm guided by the beauty of our weapons.'" And Williams said, "They are beautiful pictures of fearsome armaments making what is for them a brief flight over to this airfield," he said. He used the word beautiful 3 times in 30 seconds. And then you had President Trump dropping the largest non-nuclear bomb in the world on Afghanistan, again, within a few weeks of coming to power. George W. Bush, under Bush, that bomb had been created. The Moab, the Pentagon calls it, right, the mother of all bombs. Bush didn't dare use it. President Obama didn't dare use it. But Trump, within a few weeks, inexplicably, he drops this bomb. It has a, the radius of a mile-wide bomb blast created by this in Afghanistan. Between Syria and Afghanistan, you had people like Fareed Zakaria, not of Fox, that's of CNN, saying that Trump became president that night. You know, when it comes to war, the media circles the wagons around the White House. It's exactly when we must be apart, when we must not be a party to the parties. We have to hold those in power accountable. And then the issue of climate change. You have meteorologists on television. The reason most people tune into TV these days is because they want to check the weather, you know, what to wear. And you have these meteorologists on the networks, again, not the climate change denying Fox, but MSNBC and CNN. And when did you last hear one of these meteorologists, when talking about these disparate weather events, whether we're talking about the Dust Bowl conditions of the Midwest or the fires of California, whether we're talking about the extreme cold in the winter of the Northeast or the torrential rains and the hurricanes of the South, people can't automatically put those together unless someone explains the connection, that it's climate change, that it's the warming of the planet. These meteorologists should not be able to, you know, be considered meteorologists if they don't stop flashing the words extreme weather and severe weather, which they should flash, along with another 2 words, climate change, global warming. So it's not just what we wear, but what we can do about it. And there is something we can do about it. That's why we need a media That's not brought to us by the corporations that profit from war when we discuss war and peace. That's not brought to us by the oil, gas, coal, and nuclear companies when we talk about climate change. That's not brought to us by the insurance industry and big pharma when we talk about healthcare. That's not brought to us by the banking industry and the financial institutions when we talk about the growing inequality in this country and around the world. We need independent media, and that's what we have to build everywhere.
Andy, could I mention two things that that's a passionate speech, which I ditto, which that aroused in my mind. I'll go backwards. On the storm that you're talking about, the reason it flooded so much of Houston was that there'd been a lot of residents, rather, with no evacuation, was that they'd been building in a particular area of Houston that was not regarded as a flood area. It was a flood area, as we saw, it got flooded. But they weren't compelled to buy flood insurance in that area, and they were encouraged to build up in it because that made it cheaper, because the storm that would flood it was what they called a 1 in 500 year storm, which is what Hurricane Harvey turned out to be. So of course, how can you really allow for something that's half of 1% in any one year, 1 in 500 year storm on the average? Except that in the previous year, there had been a 1 in 500 year storm in the same area, and the year before that, there was a 1 in 500. There have been 3, the chance of which is, you can't even say how many 1 in a billion chances of that happening, with nobody suggesting that possibly the basis for their estimates had changed. The world might be changing, and that dumping fossil fuel from Texas and other places into the atmosphere was a factor in that. And one other thing that suggested to me, you mentioned the mother of all bombs, the Moab. I've forgotten what it was often described as the biggest bomb there ever was, one of the biggest in our arsenals.
Non-nuclear.
I started in my talk by saying that was a 20-ton bomb, which was the standard bomb of the RAF in the closing years of World War II. That's what the blockbuster that we were using. So we're back to that, except that, as I said, the Nagasaki-type bombs that are the trigger for other bombs are 1,000 times more powerful.
Wow.
That's great. Well, not great, but I want to continue the conversation or the discussion that Amy, where you left off with. But this is a question to both of you, and I want to add on a question that's come to us from the audience as well to this. So, in talking about the media, right? Can you talk to us, both of you, about the significance of whistleblowing? Right? In addition to the importance of independent media, is whistleblowing the only mechanism we have now, given this context that we live in, through which we can learn the truth about our institutions, right? And so this is a question from the audience, really. How realistic is it, if whistleblowing is so significant, how realistic is it for others to take, for people to take these kinds of enormous risks, right? Daniel, in the case of the Pentagon Papers, you took an enormous risk, right? How realistic is it to expect or to have, to place that pressure, right, on people?
You asking me?
Both of you. If both of you could talk about.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
You talk about the Pentagon Papers first.
What?
Talk about the Pentagon Papers
Well,
first.
no, actually, when Oli was introducing me, it reminded me that in 2006, when I got the award, I had been waiting quite a while for somebody to do this. We have, of course, leaked.
Wait, you've been waiting quite a while for that award?
For someone to leak large amounts of information of the scale that I think are necessary to establish a point, or to convince people. Thank you for making that clear here. the fact is that I had been calling for that, hoping for a long time, and I'd almost given up. I mean, it just wasn't happening. There were leaks by people all the time, every day, to some extent, as there had been before me. I was the first one to be prosecuted for a leak, and only 2 after me, then 9 under Obama. But these leaks were almost always oral, audio, occasionally a document, but of a page or 2 or a few pages. And so easy to dismiss that as saying, well, that was somebody low-level subordinate. It was just a think piece. It was, or if it was a decision, it was reversed the next day. The Pentagon Papers were, you were asked, 7,000 pages of top secret documents, a narrative essentially, 47 volumes of US decision-making. So dip in any one dull place, it's all pretty dull reading, except that you notice that the lies are not changed the next day, and the policies are not changed, and 4 presidents in a row are following much the same policy: Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson. So you had a chance then to really see this. There hadn't been anything like that by the time I got the award, I'm sorry to say. 4 years later, actually, Chelsea Manning was the answer to my prayer. And put out, now in the digital age, she was able to put out, hundreds of thousands of documents, essentially. And just to show, by the way, why that makes a difference, she showed an enormous pattern, hundreds actually, in Iraq, of soldiers who were complaining about the fact, as she did, then Bradley Manning, as she did to her intelligence officer, that the Iraqi prisoners they were handing over to Iraqi troops were going to be tortured, and were tortured. And that this not only had to be investigated, but it had to be stopped, and we couldn't turn them over. In each case, as the record showed, the answer was, don't investigate further, which itself was a violation of law. The domestic law and international law demands an investigation and demands action to stop any such thing. So they were getting illegal orders not to investigate that further, and just keep doing your job, which is handing people over to be tortured. And I just wanted to make the point, one instance of that would not show very much. She experienced that herself, that precise incident. But seeing hundreds of it, you see there is a pattern here that goes to the top, and that means the commander-in-chief, the president. It went into the Barack Obama period, and I think that's why Barack, who I give credit to for pardoning him or suspending her sentence at the end after 7 years, but he admitted then that he knew from the beginning that it was wrong to have such a sentence. She was for 30 years, 10 and a half months in solitary confinement. But the effect of that, as I say, I think the reason that she was targeted so strongly, 10 and a half months in solitary, was that her record went up into the current administration, Barack, and it showed this pattern. Well, likewise, 3 years later, of course, I don't have to repeat it, Ed Snowden comes along with an even larger number of digital documents. And again, I think he needed to put out a tremendous amount, including material that he certainly himself did not think necessarily should come out, but that journalists needed to have as background to understand what this all was. And he could only do that, communication with journalists outside the US. He took warning from Chelsea Manning and from Thomas Drake and from others who had gone to the Inspector General, who had done this and that. He knew from Chelsea's experience, he had to be out of the country. She, for 7 years, was not interviewed by one journalist, was able to get an interview with Chelsea Manning during that period. And so he knew that to explain what he was doing and to expound on it, as he's still doing, he had to be out of the country. And that's what he learned. And I've never been more proud of anything or more gratified by a feedback to hear him say, without Ellsberg, no Snowden. He said, pardon me, because, I mean, I don't usually get feedback like that. And as far as I know, Chelsea, I would love to hear, was influenced. I think she's too young even to, but not particularly. But his point was that he'd seen the movie, Most Dangerous Man, a documentary in America, and had been strengthened, he said, in doing it. Meaning,
The Most Dangerous Man in America, about Dan Ellsberg, called that by Henry Kissinger.
The full title is Most Dangerous Man in America, Daniel Ellsberg in the Pentagon Papers, and was nominated for an Oscar for longest title. So, But that had its effect, which told me that it had been a chain here as the effect of people on me, like Bob Eaton and Randy Keeler, who had gone to prison and who put the question in my mind when I heard that they were going to prison. And there, another Leonard Cohen poem that was not extolling weapons, and I don't know how ironic that was for Leonard, but he has a poem about a man about to commit suicide, actually, just for his little rag, which was, the refrain of which is, so it's come to this, it's come to this. And wasn't it a long way down? And wasn't it a strange way down? And that was ringing in my head when I had heard Randy Keeler announce that he was on his way to prison for draft resistance, which put the question in my head, how can I now help end this war now that I'm ready to go to prison? And that story is actually in the film, which Ed saw and said had an influence on him. But you know, when we listen to Amy every morning, but the recital you just gave of what's going on right now, like Monday in a, remember, yes, it was Israeli troops who were firing machine guns into that crowd, but meanwhile, kept in touch with the events in Gaza, Jared Kushner and his wife, and of course Netanyahu and American ambassador are saying, what a proud day this is for America. By the way, an event which, as Amy was explaining to me earlier, was predictably sure to ensure consequences of this rage and frustration and anguish in Gaza, where they had been nonviolently demonstrating for days. In other words, those victims were victims of American policy that you're describing. And so the question comes to you, and maybe we can converse about this a little directly. Wasn't it a long way down? It's come to this. My country has come to this. That's what I was thinking. My son, who was then 13, is born for prison, I thought. And actually, 5 years later, when he became 18, he did turn in his draft card. But just that same year, after he'd done that, Nixon stopped the draft because, for various reasons.
And also, Dan, today is May 17th, 50 years ago today, and we were just talking about this, a little preview for what you'll get on Democracy Now! Tomorrow, but also what we brought you today. Today is the 50th anniversary of Fathers Dan and Phil Berrigan and 7 other Catholic priests and lay activists burning hundreds of draft files in Catonsville, Maryland. This is the anniversary of the Catonsville 9.
And you know, when you say that, to show how...
Using homemade napalm to burn those draft files, and Dan Berrigan later writing about that burning.
Well, he said, excuse us, friends, for the sacrilege here of burning paper instead of children, instead of babies. But when you mentioned that anniversary, it occurs to me really for the first time, since you mentioned it. You were asking me if I was influenced by Catonsville at the time. Actually, I think at that moment, that was, what was the exact date?
May 17th, 1968.
Yeah. Well, I remember being extremely anguished by the death of Martin Luther King, which had just been a month earlier.
3 weeks before,
and I was working for Bobby Kennedy at that point, who was assassinated weeks later. So that's the background where a year later I was thinking, my country has come to this. But remember also, this is the 50th anniversary of March 1968, My Lai. The My Lai, where some 504, as the charge went, Oriental human beings were massacred by Americans. Americans, much like other Americans, actually, like me, like you, and so forth, not monsters from some alien planet. So I come back to the question.
But it's also the 50th anniversary of the Columbia strike in San Francisco State, 1968.
Yeah.
And that's the hope. That's people rising up together across race, across gender, across classes, and taking their country into their own hands and saying, we're going to go in a different direction.
Yeah, absolutely. What I started to say, and I lost track of it, was it's occurred to me for the first time that these actions in 68 that you're talking about, of draft resistance and burning draft cards and so forth, were the immediate background to the choice of people like Bob Eaton and Randy Keeler to go to prison the next year, without which the Pentagon Papers, for what that was worth, would not have happened. So there's a chain there that actually brings tears to my eyes when I think of it.
And can you talk about the reason or the inspiration for you and Patricia, who's here, your wife, going underground in 1971?
Yes, well, when Patricia and I turned on the TV, having just given the Pentagon Papers to Ben Bagdikian of the Washington Post, as in this movie presented in the Post just now. We did that because the Times had been enjoined for the first time in our history, kept from publishing, prior restraint. In fact, the Times considered, but didn't do it. In a way, it's too bad they didn't, publishing the 6 pages they had planned for that with blank space. They could have done that, but instead they were stopped, so we gave it to the Washington Post. Then on our way back home, we turned on the TV. I don't usually get up at 7, let alone 5. Thank you, Amy. But remember, Amy gets up at 5 for her program tomorrow morning. But
No, 3 is crew call.
Yeah, okay. But you were born the year I got into this business. That makes a difference, I like to think. That's part of the problem.
Talk about what Dan Berrigan.
Yes, Dan Berrigan then, when he was arrested after the Catonsville 9, and remember, part of the symbolism of the Catonsville 9 was not a hit and run, to stand there and wait for arrest, which for various people said, well, that defines civil disobedience. You've
Hit
done
and
your,
stay.
go to jail and whatnot. And then Berrigan decided, Dan Berrigan, no, what I did was right. I don't have to go to jail for this just because the FBI wants me. And he went underground. He eluded them in a rally at Cornell, actually. He walked off the stage under a puppet, as I recall.
Taken away in a puppet.
And would turn up here and there around the country with people. By the way, we can now say, one of the key people organizing that journey around the country underground was Howard Zinn, our friend Howard Zinn. And so I thought, well, that told me that when we turned on the TV and saw FBI agents knocking on our door in Cambridge and decided, well, we can't go home exactly, and spent 13 days then eluding the FBI while we put out the rest of the Pentagon Papers and to 17 other newspapers. And the point being, it was very much in my mind that Dan Berrigan had a creative aspect here on civil disobedience, and you did not have to defer to demands that you stop what you were doing when what you were doing was nonviolent resistance of a necessary sort, and to keep it going. And actually, if we had gone home, if we hadn't turned on the TV on that particular morning, because we happened to have been there I'd been there all night. I didn't usually see the morning news at 7 in the morning. I got off. And seeing the FBI people there, we would have gone home, been arrested. The publication of the papers would now have come out in the Post because I'd just given them to Ben Bagdikian, but that would have been it. And if the Supreme Court could have stopped the papers with an injunction, with the 2 papers, the Times and the Post, I'm virtually sure they would have come down a 5-4 with supporting the injunction. As it was, when we were putting it out to 17 other papers, where it was like, as one of the prosecutors said, herding bees, it was impossible to stop it. This question was moot by the time it got to the Supreme Court. They had no ability to stop it, including at least 5 of the judges who would have liked to do that. And so we didn't have an injunction at that point. I'm just saying chance plays its role, but really you can't know when you're starting this stuff where it will end.
So the questions are
the
piling
example
up.
of Dan Berrigan was critical in that decision.
Okay. The questions are piling up. So Amy, I'll have you take this. This is really sort of, I think it's a question that is asking you to weigh in, any advice you have for young activists. And this also brings us to the local, what was happening last week here at UCSC. So during May, last week, between May 7th and May 10th, AFS CME 3299, the union, went on strike demanding a living wage, health care, etc.
AFSCME went on strike demanding it.
So, and students protested in solidarity for those 3 days. They were met with excessive police presence, force, and brutality. There was very, very little to no media coverage. And so the question is, how can we get media to cover, to validate these kinds of experiences, to represent the unrepresented?
Well, it's a very important question, and I also want to point out that Juan Carlos Davila, who is our Democracy Now! Fellow, PhD student here, was covering those protests last week and sadly was arrested for videoing the protests, which is really unacceptable. Which goes to another issue. I mean, whether you're talking about people organizing on campus and staff workers having living wages, or teachers all over this country who are walking out of high schools and elementary schools and saying we demand higher salaries for ourselves and more funding for education overall. It's really astounding what we're seeing, this revolt across the country. And we also have to ensure that there is media that is there to cover it and that is safe to cover it and not being arrested. It also brings me to another issue that I wanted to address tonight as I saw Chase Iron Eyes in the audience. Chase, if you want to stand up. Chase will be going to court next November to trial for his activism around Standing Rock. And I'm sure many of you have heard about the standoff at Standing Rock. It was the largest unification of Native American tribes in Latin America, the United States, First Nations, and Canada that we've seen in decades in this country. And it was all happening during the presidential election of 2016. And what was amazing is the kind of activism that was taking place, led by Indigenous people, as the Standing Rock Sioux would say, was not just for them, but for everyone, fighting for a sustainable planet, challenging the Dakota Access Pipeline. In their case, it was going through their land, but they weren't alone in North Dakota. The people of Bismarck, the capital, didn't want it, and their views were respected. The people of Mandan, where the jail and the courthouses, their views were respected. They didn't want it. The Native Americans, the Standing Rock Sioux, weren't so lucky. And it is absolutely critical in a functioning democracy that you have people who safely are able to speak out, and you have a media that can cover them without being arrested, without being barred, without being jailed. So in that year of 2016, as the protests grew, I mean, it started April 1st, LaDonna Brave Bull-Allard, the unofficial historian of the Standing Rock Sioux, opens up her property along the Cannonball River to anyone who will resist. She said, to the resistance to the $3.8 billion Dakota Access Pipeline. And, you know, who knew how many people would come? Maybe a couple dozen people. And she said, you can stay on my property, except it wasn't a couple dozen. It was hundreds, and then it was thousands. And it was not only people in the United States, but all over the world, not only Native people, non-Native people, people concerned about climate change, about an economy that is not based on fossil fuels. A vision of a world that we can all live in together. And as they organized, well, we were covering it from afar. The rest of the media was hardly covering it at all. But on Labor Day weekend, the Democracy Now! Team, my colleague Dennis Moynihan is here, Laura Gottesdiener and John Hamilton and I went to North Dakota. It was a holiday weekend. What we found was amazing. You know, thousands of people in the Red Warrior Camp and Sacred Stone Camp and others who were resisting every day. And it brought up so many different issues. You know, you'd see older Indigenous women having a water ceremony in the back rural roads of North Dakota with kids and with others marching along, and they would be met by a fully militarized sheriff's department. I mean, these are the back roads of North Dakota. These are nonviolent people in their communities facing off against sheriff's departments with MRAPs, with tanks, with automatic weapons, with drones. You know the scene because we saw it after Ferguson, right? August 9th, 2014, Michael Brown is gunned down by a white police officer, his body laid out in the hot, baking August sun. Hour after hour, they never took his body away for over 4 hours. And the people just rose up in a rebellion. And what we saw there was the fully militarized police departments of suburban St. Louis attacking the people, saying, we don't accept this. And this is recycling in America today. You take the weapons from Iraq and Afghanistan and you give them to the police departments of the United States. Some of the most eloquent spokespeople against this are former police chiefs like Norm Stamper of Seattle, who was thrown out after the Battle of Seattle in 1999 because he virtually led a police riot against the protesters protesting the World Trade Organization. And he said it was the worst mistake of his life. He said when they're looking at their neighbors through the barrel of a gun, they see them as the enemy. And this is what we were seeing in North Dakota. And on September 3rd, it was a Saturday of Labor Day weekend, we were following a group of indigenous people who were going to plant their tribal flags in the area they said was their sacred burial ground. And when they got there, they didn't think that the land was being excavated. It was a holiday weekend. They saw the bulldozers operating at full tilt. And they were just enraged. They'd given a map to the judge who was going to rule the next week. He'd said, if you're saying it's your sacred burial ground, prove it to me. And so they did. And they made a map. They gave it to the judge. He gave it to the other side, as judges do. And the Native Americans there felt that the Dakota Access Pipeline used that map, leapfrogged their bulldozers to the area they designated to change the facts on the ground, to destroy the land before the judge ruled the next week. And they were just furious. So they came up on the property. They stood in front of the bulldozers, incredibly dangerous. These are earth-crushing machines. And we're just filming, and seeing this all happening. But amazingly, the bulldozers pulled back as the people came onto the property. Older women, little girls, boys, men, people with horses, and they kept moving forward, and the bulldozers were moving back. And then the Dakota Access Pipeline guards unleashed attack dogs on the Native Americans. Attack dogs. And they were biting them. The people were bleeding. They were being maced by the guards, but they kept moving forward. At a ridiculously high price, they were able to take over that land that day. The guards finally took their attack dogs. The bulldozers moved back. And that was the scene of that day. We had the videotape. We posted online that night. One of the people we interviewed was Winona LaDuke, who had pitched her tent at the Red Warrior Camp. And she said, Governor Dalrymple was the governor of North Dakota at the time. She said, Governor Dalrymple, you are not George Wallace. This is not 1963. This is not Alabama. And we posted that video online. Now, here the network's executives were telling their anchors, people aren't interested in climate change. When we posted that video online that night, and within 48 hours, there were 14 million views of this videotape. I think people do care if people deeply care if they can show the images. And that's what it's critical to do. We had to go back to New York. We continued to cover this from afar. And on Thursday night, the judge was going to rule on the following Friday. Governor Dalrymple called out the National Guard. It didn't look good for the tribe, what the ruling would be. And they also quietly issued an arrest warrant for me. I didn't know that at the time. So Friday morning, the judge is going to roll at night. We do our broadcast in New York, and then Nermeen Sheikh and I, co-host on Democracy Now!, we flew to Canada. I wasn't fleeing. I didn't know there was an arrest warrant for me. We were invited to the Toronto International Film Festival because they were premiering a film about I.F. Stone, the great muckraking journalist, and they were profiling news organizations in his footsteps, they were saying, and they profiled Democracy Now! And I wasn't going to go, but I thought, you know, we'd just been to Standing Rock, and people in Canada care about First Nations. We should just tell our eyewitness accounts after the film. I.F. Stone, by the way, told young journalists, if you're going to remember 2 words, remember governments lie. And if you can possibly remember 3 words, remember all governments lie. So that's the name of the film. You should all see it. So we talked about it there, and the next day we're speaking at the University of Toronto. I always have my phone with me, and in the middle of my speech, I looked down and it said, "You're under arrest." And I said, because this text had just come in, it said, "There's an arrest warrant for you." I thought, is this some kind of scam? Like someone in the audience just sent this thing? But then I see there's a North Dakota number. And I said, okay, I don't know if this is true, but I didn't say it to anyone. It was a group like this. I thought, you know, if it's true, you're not arrested immediately, but if it goes into the system, the warrant, and you deal with FBI, you should know about this, police or border guards, you're going to be taken. And I was in Canada, and I had to get over the border. So I just said, could someone call me a cab? And I raced to the airport, and I did make my way back to New York. And when we got there, you know, I didn't take this arrest warrant personally. I really thought it was a message to all journalists, do not go to North Dakota, which is why we had to be there. And I thought it was critical to tell young journalists, and that was the question here, young people, you know, who don't have institutional backing, don't have the finances, you don't have to get a record when you put things on the record. Yes, you should be in North Dakota. And so we went back a few weeks later to call the bluff of the authorities, and as we flew into Bismarck, we got word that they were going to quash the arrest warrant and they would drop the charges against me. Oh, except that they would bring more serious charges against me of felony riot. Like I'm a one-woman riot? And I call my North Dakota lawyer, not that I had a North Dakota lawyer before, and I said to him, what does this mean? And he said, I mean, at worst, you'll spend a year in jail. I said, what are you talking about? And I said, well, how much time do I have? And he said, well, it was Friday afternoon. Monday at 1:30, you'll be arraigned. So that was 2.5 days to cover the protests. Okay, so we went out, we filmed, we covered the protests. And on Monday, the show must go on, as it must tomorrow morning at 5 and under McHenry Library in the basement. And so we called a broadcast truck to come up from Minneapolis. We went to Mandan, and we broadcast with the backdrop of the courthouse and the jail, something that I know Chase Iron Eyes knows well. And we broadcast from the property of a church across the street. The courthouse, the jail, so I could turn myself in right after. Oh, and the 10 Commandments in between. And we broadcast the show. I interviewed, at the time, Chairman Dave Archambault, and I said, have you been arrested before? He said, yes, low-level misdemeanor. And I said, so what happened? And it was for protesting civil disobedience at Standing Rock. And he said, oh, I was strip searched, I was put in an orange jumpsuit, and I was jailed for like a parking ticket. I interviewed Dr. Sarah Jumping Eagle, someone Chase knows well, his wife. And she's the pediatrician of the Standing Rock Reservation. And I said, were you arrested? She was one of the first because she cared about the health of the children. Very concerned about the Dakota Access Pipeline being drilled under the Missouri River, the longest river in North America, that could endanger the water supply of 17 million people downstream. And I said, what happened to you? And she said, oh, I was put in an orange jumpsuit and I was strip searched and I was jailed. I mean, how much humiliation can a people take? And we did the show, and more Native Americans came to show solidarity, to perform ceremonies, and then as 1:30 was counting down to 1:30, I got a call from North Dakota Public Radio. The host knew all the players. It's a small state. Said the judge is not going to dare sign off on these charges against you. The charges are not, you're not going to be arraigned. And it wasn't only me that day. Oh, I mean, there was a lot of media attention, let's just say. The New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, Al Jazeera. It was the homepage of BBC. Vogue magazine was covering it. You know, this is what happens when the media shines a spotlight in the right direction. It wasn't just me. Native Americans who faced felony and misdemeanor charges that day, some of them had their charges dropped as well. That's what it means when we have a media that truly engages in reality TV, the reality, showing the reality of people's lives on the ground. That's what we need in this country.
Okay, another question. This is maybe for both of you, actually. We haven't talked specifically about Trump. So the question is, are we in danger of normalizing the worst leadership and the worst actors in public discourse?
How can Trump be normalized? I don't know. He's actually doing his best to keep us from getting used to this. There's a new surprise every day, in a way. He's not the first to be threatening nuclear war, nuclear first use. Actually, virtually every president has at least contemplated or discussed that with the Joint Chiefs. People are asking whether he might actually use nuclear weapons. Well, he is using nuclear weapons. He's using them the way the other presidents have all done, pointing it at somebody's head, a gun, in a confrontation. You're using the gun whether you pull the trigger or not. And if you get your way without having to pull the trigger, for most people, that's the best use of the gun. And this is not a joke to say, I don't think John Bolton is in that category. He's shown every sign that he actually wants war with North Korea and with Iran, which is really unusual, I think. And we haven't gotten to normalize that exactly yet. Trump is the first president since the Cuban Missile Crisis to be making these threats against the nuclear weapons state. I was involved in that. That was 1962, a long time ago. And since then, we've made threats against North Vietnam and many other places, actually, but not against the nuclear weapons state. So if he carried that out, that would lead to a two-sided nuclear war for the first time ever. It would not actually cause nuclear winter. They don't have enough cities to burn there. Not a joke, it's just the way it is, to cause nuclear winter. And they don't have enough weapons that would cause a nuclear winter over here. So as I said earlier, it would be millions rather than billions who would die, but it would be the most in a week or a month that had ever died in that period of time, the most violent period there ever was. Now, the question is about Trump, and Trump quotes basically, or at least he acts out, Nixon's madman theory of looking impulsive, unpredictable. He trumpets that he's unpredictable. He is unpredictable. That's very clear in many respects. But of course, people are worried, and I am among them, that this is a guy who isn't just kidding, who really is crazy and mad enough to do this. And thus, we are on the verge of a real crisis, no question. It wouldn't, as I say, cause nuclear winter, but what a war with North Korea would mean, or a war with Iran, or both, either one. And I think the first is quite possible if this summit breaks down, as is showing signs of happening right now. I think that would make the possibility of dismantling a doomsday machine out of reach, as far as I could see, as far as the eye could see. It would be a generation and more, and we don't have that much time, of living with this continual risk and the possibility of other nuclear wars. And I think, by the way, that precedent would lead not to an end to proliferation, but to proliferation. As other countries said, well, now that he's actually carrying out these threats, we better have a deterrent. Or we can make threats like that too, if we had them. Bolton's amazing statement that Libya is a case study of success is, of course, directly aimed at Kim Jong-un. It's kind of a black joke for Kim Jong-un, who clearly their whole nuclear program is based on avoiding the fate of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya for giving up this. And that's what Bolton wants him to hear, basically. If that collapses, as I say, the chance for dismantling the doomsday machine becomes even much less than it was before. And as I was saying to you earlier, it's been urgent to dismantle that doomsday machine in the way, on a much smaller scale, that it was urgent to stop building in what was really a floodplain in Houston some while ago, or it was urgent to strengthen the levees, which they knew were weak, and to raise the levees before Katrina hit New Orleans. And actually, state legislators have been asking for money for that each of 10 previous years. You could say, well, it had never happened. New Orleans had never flooded. So why worry? Well, in the same way, no, the nuclear war has not exploded. The threat has not been carried out for 70 years, but I think that is due, as I look at it, to a tremendous lot of luck. And it could happen again for another 70 years, but it's very unlikely. It's a miracle that we're here today after the Cuban Missile Crisis and after a crisis in 1983. It would be, it's not the miracle I want to count on to do that again. And one last thought occurs to me as I was listening to your amazing talk here just now about your own actions and in North Dakota, what's going on in North Dakota. There is something else in North Dakota that hasn't attracted any television, and it's hard to do it. It's not very photogenic. It's what's in a number of holes in the ground. In Minot Airfield, where there's one of the last Minuteman bases with, I forget whether it's now 50 or maybe 150 Minuteman missiles. If it's 150, that could cause nuclear winter. These are targetable bases, then, covered by concrete until an alert occurs when the covers are moved, in North Dakota. And these missiles have, even from a Cold War point of view, my old nuclear war planner, systems analyst perspective, have been totally unnecessary, dangerous, obsolete, anachronistic for over half a century. When the Soviets got, and now the Russians have, submarine launch missiles, which these ICBMs can't target, but which can target, their submarines can target our ICBMs, so there's this use them or lose them. In North Dakota is a trigger to a doomsday machine, which should not exist in North Dakota. Those missiles should not be there. And I was just in Washington for about 10 days asking people on the Hill and others, what explains, what in the world is keeping these missiles in existence? They're dangerous. It would be worth, we're rebuilding them at cost of scores of billions of dollars by both Obama and Trump. Spending that money, it would be worth that much money to get rid of them. It would lower our danger. So what's the explanation? And the answer is one explanation: jobs in North Dakota and Wyoming and Montana. And the senators from those states told Obama, and now Trump again, do not take these things off alert, where they're the hair trigger. Do not get rid of them. Keep them on hot alert, because that's more jobs, more people, more restaurants, more real estate. This is the reason for keeping this. It's astonishing in its way. But civil disobedience of the kind you're describing is well called for in this case as well. And what I'm saying is North Dakota connects with the pipeline, the climate issue, and the doomsday machine issue. And the indigenous people there are showing us a way.
And I would just say, to the question, are we in danger of normalizing Trump? I think what's happening here is that dissent is being normalized. Dissent is what is being normalized.
Good.
And that is extremely important. I mean, just today on Democracy Now! We reported what President Trump said yesterday. President Trump talking about immigrants, saying, "You wouldn't believe how bad these people are. They aren't people, they're animals." This following, you know, when he first came to office talking about Mexicans as rapists. And I think, though, people are not accepting this. From the moment he was inaugurated, the next day, 3 times the size of the crowd, led by women, not only in Washington, but 750,000 people in Los Angeles. In every hamlet and village you had, I mean, in Montpelier, Vermont, 20,000 people per, they had to shut down the interstate. They said the Capitol couldn't take any more people. In Park City, Utah, you had 10,000 people marching down the main street. When a few weeks later, or was it days later, when President Trump announces the Muslim ban, just spontaneously all over the country, people race to their airports. You're seeing the best of America at the same time that you see these tremendous threats. When he debases all of us by talking about Africa as a shithole country, as a country, Africa. We'll put that aside because I think the curse is what we should be talking about. Not to mention Haiti and El Salvador. I mean, that's the first time I'd seen curses actually printed out in the national network media, because you have to repeat what the president has said. I tried to tone it down, especially on public broadcasting. They still might be upset. And so I said S-hole, right? And everyone thought I was saying asshole. So, but you think about what he has said about immigrants and the enormous threat to the people who have built this country. I mean, that's over centuries, but especially today. But then you think about the sanctuary cities, in California, a sanctuary state. Look at what has happened. I mean, when we travel across the country, I go from church to church interviewing people like Jeanette Vizqueta in a Denver Unitarian church who's being protected by the congregation. And her little 10-year-old boy, Roberto, says to me, as they're sitting in the basement of the church, she was going on a Cesar Chavez march that day. But Jeanette couldn't go out. She was a Mexican immigrant who's lived here for more than 20 years, but was being targeted by ICE. And Roberto has his arm around his mother as he talks. Him standing is shorter than her sitting. And he says, I must be my mother's voice. And so he was taking a beautiful picture that his teacher had made, a picture of Jeanette, and carrying it at the front of the Cesar Chavez March with his little 6-year-old sister. What would happen then? The police chief of Denver told Jeanette, I have your back. If you're threatened in any way, you tell me. And then ICE had to back down. And then the local congressman got a private bill passed in Congress to protect her. And Time magazine named her one of the 100 most important and most influential people in the country. Yes, this is the best of America. And finally, I think of, you know, the Charlottesville March. The horror is not that you had hundreds of young white men marching and chanting these racist, anti-Semitic slogans. It's that what was more frightening to me is that, and they were proud Klan members, is that they weren't wearing hoods. Why is that so threatening? Because they found that they were safe in America with the president that they worshiped and extolled, President Trump. They didn't have to cover their faces. And yes, they chanted all of that, and they killed a beautiful young woman named Heather Heyer. But you think of what she said, her last phrase on her Facebook page, and I think people across the political spectrum in this country now feel this way. If you're not outraged, you're not paying attention. Mm-hmm.
That's a really hopeful, wonderfully, that is the audacity of hope, I think, Amy. So this is the last, unfortunately we're running out of time, so this is the last question, which is both hopeful but also asking, I think, kind of a broader, larger question. So I'll just read this. This is from somebody in the audience. As a young Puerto Rican, I have tremendously valued the continual coverage of the struggles of Puerto Ricans before and after the most recent Hurricane Maria on Democracy Now! What do you have to say to young people struggling to resist disaster capitalism?
Well, again, I want to thank Juan Carlos. Again, we went together with Dennis Moynihan, our team in Democracy Now! To Puerto Rico to cover what happened there. And also bringing together the other question asked by a member of the audience about the protests that have been taking place at UC Santa Cruz and other places, and the local union AFSCME. It made me think about this just critical, historic year, the year that Dr. King was assassinated and all that he taught us, April 4th, 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee. What was he doing there? He was there to help sanitation workers organize a local of AFSCME, the American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees. And he died a year to the day, April 4th, 1967, that he gave that remarkable speech at Riverside Church in New York, where he spoke out against the triple threat of racism, materialism, and militarism. And he warned the country and the world. And for young people who think, well, it was easy for him because anything he said, you know, everywhere, he was an icon. It's harder for us because we risk everything here. No, it wasn't easy for him. He was vilified for that speech, for speaking out against the war in Vietnam. His inner circle said, Martin, don't do this. You've got the President of the United States wrapped around your finger. You got him to sign the Civil Rights Act, Lyndon Johnson. You got him to sign the Voting Rights Act. This war isn't your war. Don't take on the Vietnam War. And he said no. In that speech, he said the country he loved, the United States, was the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. The corporate media went after him. From the New York Times to Life magazine to Time magazine, they said his speech sounded like a script out of Radio Hanoi. He had done a disservice to his cause, his country, and his people. And he just doubled down. And for the next year, he spoke out even more fiercely and began to lead the Poor People's Campaign, which was just taken up this April 4th by Reverend William Barber and Reverend Liz Theo-Harris and the whole movement of Moral Mondays in North Carolina and people all over the country saying, yes, workers on every campus deserve dignity, saying that teachers all over this country must be paid, that education has to be paid for, saying that the longest war in the world, and the longest war the U.S. engaged in the world in Afghanistan, these are not acceptable. Putting all these issues together, I think, is what Dr. King taught us, and is something that we have to remember. And remember, it wasn't easy for him when he was alive, and that it just contributes, or that just proves how remarkably brave and courageous he was.
Thank you. Daniel, did you want to add a concluding statement?
I almost hate to add anything, but once again, it brings back some memories. Does anybody have a copy of my book here?
You have it.
Because it ends with a quotation from that speech, which, again, a part that is not very well remembered. You know, listening to you, and it's not just an honor to be with you here, Amy, but your eloquence is marvelous, and your passion is marvelous. And I love hearing it. It did make me think. You know, I grew up during World War II, 10 when Pearl Harbor happened. The war had started earlier, 14 when it ended. But that was a war which we understood to be a war against aggression, and it was, actually. And we were not on the wrong side in that war. We were not the wrong side, as in Vietnam. which was the war you grew up in, if I'm not mistaken, and Vietnam. And it made me wonder, really, I haven't asked you this question, whether you had illusions to lose. Can you remember a time when you had illusions about this country that you've had to shed? And I want a little comment, but if you want to comment on that, I'd like to hear it.
I would like to hear the quote in the book.
Well, I'll just say that I did have a lot. I wasn't wrong about World War II in the sense of who we were fighting and what the cause was. When I was in the Marines, I extended to go over to Suez, where our President Eisenhower, who expanded the doomsday machine enormously, but also he opposed what was called aggression by our closest allies. And I was proud of that. I was in Alexandria Harbor, being actually bombed at one point by the British and French, interestingly, which have not been together in bombing till Syria, just now, right? I was thinking of that when I watched it. But you mentioned words that are not spoken by the media. You know, when the biography we got of each got of our fellow laureates here, Right Livelihood laureates, mine is fairly different from all of the others, actually. I'm not sure whether some ever worked for any government, all of whom lie, as I.F. Stone pointed out, but certainly not in what is wrongly, misleadingly called the Defense Department or the national security apparatus, as I had. And so the effect is when you read my biography and you see war planning, Vietnam, State Department, Defense Department, RAND Corporation, it's clear that I alone in this group spent the first third of my adult life doing wrong livelihood. And fortunately, that did give me something to to reveal later. But my intentions at the time, you asked a bit, how could I do this? Well, I was not aware that since World War II, what I was working was as a servant of empire. And the word empire is another of these words, like, as you say, climate and war, that doesn't get discussed. What is discussed and has been normalized, and I was very startled when I first saw it, when President Clinton was being pressed by the New Century model for regime change in Iraq. And I thought, regime change? What is this? Where do we get the right to change regimes somewhere else? Well, that's the definition of empire, is deciding the governments of other people, of other nation, who shall live and who shall die, and the government's there. And that has been normalized by all parties. Regime change is what we're up to. Shouldn't we do it? Don't we have an obligation to do it? When all these people, and that's going to be an explanation for North Korea, for Iran, Bolton uses those words. Regime change in Iran is what he wants. Well, that is empire, and it's not in a good sense. It's in a very, very dangerous sense. So the difference between us and other empires doesn't really show up so much in Afghanistan, which is Vietnam again, essentially, and has every possibility of going on for another 16 years, which could have happened with Vietnam if Nixon had not been driven out of office. And, but that's empire as usual. And Iraq even, with maybe 1 million dead and so forth, empire as usual. What was different for the US was an instrument of empire, which was criminal massacre, which we had used in World War II, picking up an instrument of the Nazis and the Japanese, from the London Blitz, from the Japanese bombing of Shanghai in 1932, and again 37, the first use of bombing against civilians. So by another country. In other words, a new form of warfare, which we picked up tenfold. And then the preparation we've made ever since is for another tenfold and 100-fold, you know, for everybody, essentially, at stake. So when Martin Luther King, actually the last words in my book are these. In that very April 4th speech that he was giving, which is a tremendously good speech, very much worth rereading. I read it at least once a year, and it comes up on April 4th. Best analysis of Vietnam you can find around, practically. In that speech when he talked about the fierce urgency of now, which I was been talking about, how urgent it is to change. He was speaking of the madness of Vietnam, but he also alluded on that same occasion to nuclear weapons and to the even larger madness that has been the subject of this book. And the theme of this book essentially is madness, the madness of what has been going on for the last 70 years. Empire armed with the threat of mass annihilation. And what he said in that speech was, we still have a choice today: nonviolent coexistence or violent co-annihilation. And then he said, we must move past indecision to action. If we do not act, we shall surely be dragged down the long, dark, and shameful corridors of time, reserved for those who possess power without compassion, might without morality, and strength without sight. Now let us begin. Let us now rededicate ourselves to the long and bitter but beautiful struggle for a new world. Thank you.